Is the Times building going to have its cojet on 24/7, providing power plus throughput going back to Con Ed? And does Con Ed like to lose a monopoly to cojet in the city?
No, it's only for it's only sized for the load that the Times creates in 24/7, which means it's about a third of their of the building itself. The Con Ed, we had the same problem with fuel cells on 4 Times Square. We would not take the power back. There's several reasons for that they gave us, which I think are valid. Number one, they don't need the power because they have nuclear power or hydropower that's running all night long on the grid. And also, they can't control where the power is off and on. So if they're working in the system underground or whatever the case may be, they can't be sure that they aren't going to create a hazard.
Yeah, there just isn't a vehicle for net metering right now, but it does hurt them in that they lose revenue because it acts as a big peak shaver. So the utility rates for the building are reduced, so they do lose revenue that way. And after the big blackout in August, was that 2002 maybe or 3? I called Jody Durst and I said, hey, how'd the fuel cells do? And he said, well, the first thing they did was they're going to shut them down. When that thing could have lit several city blocks, at least for emergency power. And that was rather unfortunate.
Yes.
When you have a dual use water system, you describe it. If I understand correctly, when you said even the waste that's in the third tertiary remains there, the sewage system, am I correct? Even your own tertiary recovery too?
Well, there are some non-biologicals that do progress into the sewer system, more on a Saturday morning than on a Tuesday morning. But most of the stuff is ground up or digested by microbials or bacteria and self-digested. But there is a small amount of sludge which has to be pumped out or released into the system.
How do you deal with the issue of the smell?
Smell?
No, it's,
Go away.
yeah, I mean, it's a self-contained process, completely sealed. The first levels of the Blackwater treatment facility are really chemical-based, like bacteria chemical, and the latter stages are all controlled in there's like these giant concrete chambers. Is I guess the best way to describe it.
I was just curious about the risk of ice buildup on the glass cylinders of the New York Times building. Is that being managed? As it can be a possible problem at all?
Well, that's a good question. We did a great deal of testing, environmental chamber testing, different temperature conditions with snow, developing freeze-thaw cycles and so forth, and determined the nature of the condition, and it's possible in a really sticky snow that you would get a wall of snow. And several provisions have been made. There's a canopy at the base of the building to protect the sidewalk, and there are certain in a very, very high wind condition. There will probably be days once every 10 years or so where they'll have to close down that section of the street. Yes.
I worked down at the Battery Park City with the Albanese, with the teams, by the way. And as I'm getting more and more into green, which I'm with BBC, we just started doing something on the green roof, and in my knowledge of plumbing, which is my expertise, is that one of the things that the sewage treatment plants they talked about is that it was the storm that was creating a major problem on the sewage treatment plants. And so going with a green roof, seemed to have a lot more logical sense in terms of...
And you retain the water, yes.
Right.
Yes, that's one of its most positive
For people
impacts.
For people who aren't aware, we have a combined sewer and stormwater system. So when there's an extreme rain, the stormwater overflows the sewer system and they have to divert it to the Hudson River. So you have combined sewage and stormwater going into our river. So by planting green roofs, they would absorb potentially a lot of the water that falls on them and wouldn't make it into the storm sewer system. So that would help in those cases where you have a huge rain.
And Barry, you say you wouldn't let us use the gray water for irrigation. What we did was we recycled the storm water.
Well, yeah, and it's funny because if you go halfway and you just do gray water, which is not the stuff that you flush, but everything else, it's actually a lot more difficult to implement than just going the full way. Because when you go the full way, you get clean water. Yes.
Well, it's very hard to generalize because every building type is different. And if it's a corporation building a building for itself, there's just no question you're going to gain that return. If it's a developer building a spec building, the only return they can get up till now has been the energy. If they're saving energy in the building, which is a very minor part of the total consumption of the building, the payback is not all that great. But the tenant who is net metered will benefit by having a very energy efficient building where they are occupied.
And I feel like it's part of general, but you use those for office, corporate, residential, retail, rather than making them into a different project. Like this thing, there's a lot of things that we should be gathering on office connectivity, or less of a manufacturing, more services.
Yes. Well, on the productivity, there is a lot of data. I mean, 85% of an operation is wages, salaries, where 15% is all the other costs, and a fraction of that is your energy use, for example. So that's why I say if you can save 10% of 85%, you're talking. You don't have to have an MBA to figure that out. And so that's what attracts their attention. When we're going to see a client, we're trying to sell them on the idea of making a green building and trying to make sure they don't throw us out. Words like that catch their attention. And then marketing a residential building, for example, they can start saying this is a healthier building. And Battery Park City has a number of not statistics, but cases where people with asthma have moved into those buildings and haven't had asthma since, and things like that. And that sort of thing is what they like to hear.
But it's a litigious society at times that we live in, right? So these are guarded pieces of information. Several of our clients don't want to give their other buildings any less distinction, and they don't certainly want people to feel like if they're in the other building, they're not going to be as healthy.
Well, actually, Fort Times Square, we had a program all set up. We had the software developed and everything where we were going to, Condé Nast was going to do a survey for the 2 years they had in their existing spaces, which were all over the city, where a computer screen would have a window pop up and say, how are you feeling today? Or you have a headache or whatever the
Are
case
you
is.
here?
And then after they moved in, they were going to continue to do that to compare. And guess who stopped it? The lawyers. Because they were very afraid of litigation because they demonstrated, if they had the proof that the previous environment was not healthy, and somebody got sick, they got as lawyers. But there have been some surveys that have been done, particularly out west, by a number of institutions, very, very firm evidence.